Hey guys, tonight we begin with something both darkly fascinating and oddly comforting. The strange, absurd, sometimes hilarious punishments that our medieval ancestors believed would keep the world from falling apart. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You breathe in the quiet of your room, but your mind slips somewhere else, into the thick, smoky air of a medieval street, narrow, crooked, alive with the mingled smells of tallow, rain-soaked wool, and the faint sweetness of bread baked too early and already burning. It's dusk, and the bells are beginning to toll, not for prayer, but for obedience, the nightly curfew, the ancient couvre-feu, a law as physical as the sound of the iron tongue striking bronze. The rule was simple. When the bell rang, every fire must be covered, every lamp dimmed, and every wandering body indoors, or else face a punishment that ranged from a fine to a night in the stocks where the rats were bolder than your dignity. The air is thick with authority. You can almost feel it pressing against your chest like the heat from a forge. Somewhere, a man curses as he scrambles to extinguish his hearth, and you imagine the absurdity of being punished for leaving a candle a few minutes too long, as if God himself were standing over the wax counting the seconds. Yet, historians still argue whether curfew laws were truly about fire safety or simply about control, about teaching people to fear the sound of order. One theory insists it was civic protection in a time of timber towns, but another whispers that it was surveillance disguised as virtue, the medieval version of lights out, the sheriff's watching. Either way, the world after the bell was a darker one, full of rules that blurred the line between discipline and delusion. You walk along the cobbled street now, your shoes slick with something that might be rain or might be chamber pot runoff, and you try not to think too hard about it. Every door is shut, every shutter drawn, and in that uniform silence, you catch the absurd heartbeat of a society obsessed with control. The punishment for breaking curfew might seem mild, maybe a coin, maybe a cold bench, but it's the philosophy behind it that chills you. Imagine living in a world where sleep itself was legislated, where yawning in public might be seen as laziness, and where the local bailiff could fine you for idleness of face. There's even one recorded case, somewhere in the dusty archives of the 13th century, of a man fined for disturbing peace with excessive yawning during a sermon. A reminder that even exhaustion had legal consequences. You chuckle softly. Medieval life was a comedy written in ink and blood. The bread laws alone could have turned half the population into criminals overnight. Imagine the local baker sweating over his oven, terrified that his loaves might weigh an ounce too light, because the assize of bread and ale decreed that fairness had a flavor and it was measurable in grams. One loaf too light and you'd be shamed before your neighbors, your bread confiscated and displayed as evidence that greed could be weighed. You picture it, a crowd gathered around a crooked table, the town clerk holding up a loaf like it's a severed head, declaring, "This man tried to cheat his fellow Christians by 1 ounce of air." If you're lucky, you're only fined. If not, you're tossed into the pillory where every child gets to express their civic duty by throwing rotten fruit at your moral failing. There's a kind of tragic poetry in it, the idea that bread, the very symbol of daily survival, could also be your undoing. The historians of today still debate whether these laws were born from genuine economic fairness or just another way to remind peasants who baked the rules. You can almost see the council meeting. Yes, God wants just weights, but he also wants us to control who eats how much. It's bureaucracy wrapped in piety, seasoned with hypocrisy and baked to perfection. You step into the marketplace, where the smell of yeast and sweat blend with the tang of iron from the blacksmith's stall. Everything feels alive yet anxious, as if the town itself is always waiting for judgment. Somewhere, a friar preaches about sin and consumption, while a merchant quietly adjusts his scale to make a coin's weight vanish. Justice here isn't blind. It's slightly cross-eyed and deeply invested in its own convenience. And still, amid the absurdity, there's something strangely human about it. People believed that laws kept the darkness away, that order was the only thing standing between the town and chaos. Even the punishments carried a kind of ritual rhythm, the stocks placed by the market so everyone could witness sin turned into spectacle, the crier shouting sentences with theatrical flair, the same words echoing every week as if morality could be rehearsed into existence. You can hear the sound of laughter sometimes, too, not mockery, but weary amusement, because even then, they knew how ridiculous it all was. A miller fined for letting his donkey graze on church grass, a woman punished for washing clothes on a saint's day, a drunk sentenced to carry a bucket of his own ale through town while children followed chanting rhymes about temperance. The punishment wasn't just pain, it was theater. And you, wandering through this echoing world, begin to sense that maybe that's the point. Maybe justice in the medieval mind was less about fairness and more about story, about making an example that everyone could see and whisper about. You feel the cold bite of evening deepen. The curfew bell has long since faded, replaced by the occasional bark of a dog, or the creak of a shutter that moves in the wind. You imagine how the night must have felt to them, safe only when supervised, sacred only when still. In some towns it was even illegal to sing after dark, unless it was a hymn. Picture that, the world's first noise complaint, enforced by divine authority. Somewhere, a man hums to himself in the dark, and a watchman writes his name in the book of fines. You can almost smell the ink drying, hear the scratch of the quill. There's something simultaneously absurd and beautiful in it. The idea that silence itself could be property, owned and rented by those who rang the bells. And as the night closes in, you realize how easy it would have been to slip into fear without even noticing. A life measured not in freedom but in permissions, where every act of defiance was as small as keeping a candle burning. The irony, of course, is that even as they covered their fires, the human spirit never stayed fully contained. You picture the quiet rebellion of someone lighting a single hidden flame after the bell, a mother mending clothes, a scholar reading forbidden parchment, a baker testing dough for dawn. Tiny acts of resistance flickering like stars against the ceiling of control. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the punishments grew so elaborate. Because no matter how many laws they passed, no matter how many fines they wrote, people always found a way to keep the light alive. Somewhere between fear and laughter, between crime and survival, the medieval world created a strange dance, one where obedience and absurdity twirled hand in hand under the same moon. You take a deep breath, tasting the air of another age, soot, bread, rain, and something faintly sweet, like freedom pretending to be fear. The street fades around you, and only the echo of the bell remains, heavy and slow, marking the hour not just of night but of human history repeating itself, one curfew at a time. You can almost still hear the echo of that curfew bell as morning drips into being, the sound stretching into daylight like melted wax, and the world begins to hum again with the rhythm of commerce, gossip, and the holy fear of underweight bread. You walk toward the heart of town, past the market cross where yesterday's punishments were displayed like cautionary art, and already you can smell the yeast rising before you even see the ovens, warm, earthy, the scent of survival itself. In medieval England, fairness had a smell, and it was supposed to come baked into every loaf under the assise of bread and ale, the ancient law that tried to measure honesty in ounces and faith in fermentation. It sounds noble in theory, the idea that no baker or brewer should cheat their neighbors, that the price of your daily loaf should rise and fall with the price of grain, like the moral tide of the economy. But as you weave through the narrow lanes, you see the absurdity bubbling just under the crust. A boy rings a handbell, announcing that the ale conner will begin his rounds. The official ale inspector, whose divine duty is to sit in taverns, drink on behalf of justice, and then solemnly declare whether the brew was worth its coin. You can't help but grin. History's first quality control job was literally to get tipsy for the greater good. And the bakers, poor souls, were not so lucky. Their punishment for deception wasn't a fine, it was humiliation baked at high heat. 1 ounce too light and your bread could land you in the pillory, or worse, the baker's ladder. A wooden contraption that hoisted you above the crowd while people pelted you with stale rolls, proving that irony was alive and well even in the 13th century. The scent of burning loaves mingles with the damp smell of sweat and livestock as you pass by the stalls. You can almost hear the crackle of wood in the communal ovens, the hiss of water flung on the stones, the soft thud of dough kneaded by hands that know fear as much as hunger. Somewhere, a woman mutters a charm against bad yeast, drawing a cross in the flour before folding it into the bowl. She whispers that if you bake on the wrong saint's day, your loaf will fall flat, and the devil himself will sit upon it. Historians still argue whether these rituals were simple superstition or encoded economics, tiny gestures of resistance against a system that turned food into arithmetic. You imagine the scholars, centuries later, poring over parchment, debating in the dust of libraries whether medieval bakers were holy accountants or quiet anarchists with aprons. One thing is certain: bread was never just bread. It was theology, livelihood, and reputation, all baked into one fragile crust. There's a myth, whispered even now in old kitchens, that each loaf carried a sacred weight. The honest loaf, they called it, and if you baked it perfectly, angels would breathe upon the steam. You smile at that, partly because it's poetic, partly because it's absurdly human to think that God had a favorite carb. Yet in a world where famine was a yearly guest, the boundary between sacred and practical blurred beautifully. People didn't just bless their bread, they bargained with it. The village priest would sometimes hold a loaf aloft at the altar, invoking divine balance over the market, while mothers taught their children to tap the bottom of every loaf to make sure no witch had stolen its rise. The irony: those same mothers might later be accused of witchcraft themselves if their bread rose too high. Success could smell suspicious in a hungry century. You turn a corner and step into a bakery, the kind of place where history clings to the walls like soot. The baker's arms are dusted white, his face ruddy with heat, his eyes flicking nervously toward the scales on the counter. Every loaf must match the price tables pinned to the wall, adjusted weekly by the mayor's clerk. The parchment is smudged, the numbers confusing, but that's no defense. If your loaf is even a few drams off, you're branded as dishonest. It's astonishing, you think, how civilization invented paperwork before plumbing. You watch him slice into a loaf, the sound crisp as a confession, and you smell the dense, nutty heart of barley and rye. There's nothing romantic about it. This bread is heavy, sour, the kind that feeds bodies, not dreams. Yet it's the cornerstone of justice. The town crier outside shouts about false bread, while a group of children giggle, hoping to see someone dragged to the stocks. Public shame is the glue that holds this world together. Sin tastes better when shared. Somewhere in the background, a brewer pours ale into a wooden tankard, nodding to the inspector who raises his eyebrows in approval. The ale smells sweet and murky, with hints of herbs and regret. The assize of ale was supposed to protect drinkers from watered-down trickery, but it also gave officials a reason to drink before noon, a reminder that every law, no matter how moral, comes with a loophole lubricated by convenience. You picture the ale conner, solemn as a judge, staggering home after a long day of public service, muttering that justice has a hangover. It's hard not to laugh. The whole thing feels like a divine comedy where God is the brewer and humanity keeps spilling the mug. The scholars who study this period say the bread and ale laws were an early attempt at consumer protection, but you sense something more theatrical in it, an attempt to prove that morality could be measured, that sin could be sliced and weighed and sold at a fair rate. You imagine the sermons. A dishonest loaf endangers the soul. And maybe, in their own strange way, they were right. Hunger turns honesty into luxury. You take another step outside, into the brightness of noon. The square glows gold, the dust rising in lazy halos, and somewhere a minstrel strums a lute, singing about a baker who loved too freely and paid the price in public flooring. The melody is jaunty, but the message is sharp. In a world of scarcity, fairness must be seen to exist, even if it doesn't. You can almost taste the bitterness of it on your tongue, like burnt crust. A farmer argues with a merchant about the price of barley. The merchant quotes scripture. The farmer spits in the dirt. Even the Lord cannot fill an empty stomach with justice, he growls, and you can't help but agree. Justice here is not about mercy, it's about order. The bread laws don't stop hunger, they organize it. You pass a poster nailed to a post, a baker's mark and a fine amount, scrawled beneath the town seal. The ink smells metallic, almost bloody, and the parchment flaps in the breeze like a warning. Beneath it, someone has drawn a crude doodle of a man being hit with a baguette, proof that satire was alive and scratching long before newspapers. You can't resist a quiet laugh. Even oppression had its graffiti. Beyond the square, the smell of hops and malt thickens, curling through the alleys. The Brewers' Guild meets behind a tavern door. Voices low, laughter spilling out in cautious bursts. They talk about taxes, grain shortages, and how the ale tastes weaker this year. A rumor passes that the miller's been watering the malt with holy water to purify it. Superstition is marketing strategy. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in the sacred chemistry of beer or whether it was just good branding. But in a world where water could kill you and ale could keep you alive, faith and fermentation were partners in crime. You take a sip in your imagination, the taste thick and slightly sour, like bread that forgot how to rise. It warms the throat, numbs the worries, and makes the absurdity of law easier to swallow. Around you, life feels both fragile and fierce. People joke about being fined for breathing too greedily, but the laughter carries fatigue. You realize that beneath the humor, there's a profound truth. Every loaf, every mug, every law is a negotiation between survival and obedience. The assize promised balance, but balance in a world of hunger is just another word for control. Still, there's beauty here too. The way sunlight hits the flour in the air, turning dust into halos, the rhythm of wooden paddles against oven walls, the chorus of human persistence humming beneath the fear. You picture the baker, again at dawn, kneeling before his dough, as if before an altar, whispering the same prayer his grandfather did. Let it rise, Lord, let it rise. And, for a moment, all the absurdity fades. The laws, the punishments, the fines, they all dissolve into something tender, almost holy. Because when you live in a world where fairness is fragile and food is faith, every loaf that rises is a small miracle. And maybe that's what kept them going. Not the threat of punishment, but the hope that somewhere in the steam and scent of honest bread, the universe still believed in mercy. The smell of fresh bread fades behind you as you wander into the next corner of medieval absurdity. Fashion, that glittering battlefield of class, vanity, and divine suspicion, the market square is a tapestry of texture and sound, velvet brushing against burlap, feathers twitching on caps, the faint rattle of jewelry that says, "I'm holier and richer than you." You feel it before you see it, the pulse of status fluttering in the air, as visible as the colors forbidden to most of the people wearing them. Sumptuary laws, they were called, the great social commandments of appearance, and they read less like regulations and more like heavenly dress codes carved by very bored bureaucrats. These were the laws that told you not just what to wear, but who you were. If you were a knight's son, fine, wear your silk, strut your hose, but if you were a merchant pretending at nobility, even your buttons could betray you. Literally, buttons were once symbols of sin, tiny temptations sewn along the edge of propriety. One decree forbade commoners from wearing gold-threaded cloth, another outlawed purple dye for anyone below a baron. Purple, that royal pigment squeezed from thousands of mollusks, was apparently so sacred that wearing it without permission was like stealing sunlight. You picture it now. Some poor fishmonger's wife caught in violet trim, blushing harder than the color itself as the bailiff measures her hemline. The punishment? A fine, of course, or worse, public humiliation. And historians still argue whether these laws were truly about moral modesty or just another way to remind the middle class they'd better stay in their lane. Some say it was to curb economic waste, others whisper it was fashion policing, medieval edition, a way for elites to stop the newly rich from looking too comfortable. You can almost hear the echo of a lord complaining. If peasants start wearing feathers, how will I know whom to condescend to? The street itself becomes a runway of contradiction. A monk hurries by in rough wool, clutching his robe as though modesty were leaking from its seams, while a lady in a towering hennin, those absurd cone hats, passes like a swan among pigeons. Her veil flaps dramatically in the breeze, nearly decapitating a chicken vendor. Somewhere, a tailor mutters curses about the new statute requiring sleeves to stop at the wrist for those earning under £10 a year. You laugh quietly. Imagine a world where your income could be read in your cuffs, and yet there was something intoxicating about the rules themselves, the thrill of bending them. People found loopholes, of course. The law might forbid ermine, but no one said anything about white rabbit fur. Close enough to nobility, if you squinted, the local dye maker became a hero overnight when he invented merchant blue, a color just different enough from the noble azure to escape the gallows of good taste. The lines between sin and silk blurred with every stitch. There's one particularly ridiculous ordinance from 14th century Florence that forbade women from wearing excessive feathers, as if vanity could be weighed in plumage. Feathers were dangerous. They symbolized arrogance, pride, and sometimes even demonic flirtation. You picture the court clerk solemnly writing it down, probably with a quill, blissfully unaware of the irony. It gets better. In England, a man could be fined for wearing shoes with points longer than 6 inches because apparently God drew the line at aerodynamic footwear. Some of these points were so long they had to be tied to the knees with little golden chains to keep men from tripping over their own status. It's absurd, but you almost admire the dedication suffering for fashion was already a medieval art form. The scholars who study these things still debate whether these edicts worked or merely entertained. After all, when the law tells you not to look fabulous, isn't that the surest invitation to do exactly that? You step into a tailor's shop, dim and fragrant with the mingled smells of wool, candle grease, and ambition. Bolts of fabric line the walls, muted colors for the poor, jeweled hues for the few who can afford to defy gravity and law. The tailor looks at you the way a priest might look at a confessed heretic, curious, judgmental, secretly admiring your nerve. On the table lies a scarlet doublet, illegal for common wear, its threads glinting like captive fire. The tailor runs a hand over it with reverence. For a merchant's daughter, he murmurs, who insists her soul is worth a little sin. You grin. The air tastes faintly of rebellion. In a society where identity was uniformed by decree, dressing out of your class was a kind of quiet revolution. Every band feather, every stolen ribbon was an act of protest disguised as preening. Out in the street, the sumptuary inspector, imagine a fashion cop with a crucifix, walks by, his expression torn between righteousness and envy. He checks collars, counts jewels, scolds apprentices for lace. You can't help but imagine him in the 21st century, patrolling Instagram with a clipboard. Back then, though, he carried real power. A young baker's wife once spent a night in the stocks for daring to wear a silk girdle gifted by her cousin. Her defense? The girdle did not know my station. Humor aside, the cruelty ran deep. Clothing was control. You were what you could afford not just to wear, but to survive being seen in. The laws said they protected moral order, but really, they protected visibility. Who got to be beautiful in public and who had to stay invisible. And yet, even here, laughter leaked through the seams. People mocked the laws in taverns, swapping stories about nobles caught wearing outlawed linen by accident. There's one anecdote of a bishop fined for his velvet slippers after forgetting he'd walked into town without changing, a small, delicious scandal that made its way through Europe faster than the Black Death. The smell of dye thickens as you pass the river where women rinse cloth, turning the water into a rainbow of forbidden dreams. Their hands are red-stained, their laughter bold. They joke that every drop of color costs a prayer. And maybe it does. There's a superstition among them that certain colors attract spirits. Green invites fairies. Red wards off jealousy. Black confuses the devil. You can almost see it. A crowd of peasants cloaked in shades chosen as much for spiritual safety as social camouflage. A historian once wrote that color itself was a medieval language of sin, each hue a confession. You imagine the debates that must have raged in dusty councils. Is crimson too proud or merely festive? Does saffron inspire lust or just brighten a gloomy Sunday? The arguments sound absurd, yet beneath them lies something universal, the fear of too much freedom, too much beauty. You pause before a merchant's stall displaying imported silks, shimmering like trapped sunlight. The air hums with temptation. The merchant leans close, whispering prices low enough to make your pulse quicken. He assures you the bishop's men are elsewhere, inspecting hat brims for indecency. You touch the silk. It's cool, smooth, a quiet rebellion beneath your fingertips. The thought crosses your mind that maybe all human progress starts with someone breaking a dress code. A gust of wind rattles the wooden sign above you, and a feather drifts down from someone's hat, landing at your feet like a tiny exiled angel. You can't help but laugh. It's easy to dismiss these laws as quaint relics, but they speak volumes about the medieval mind. Control of the body, the face, the fabric. It all tied back to the belief that order could be worn like armor. In a world constantly on the brink of chaos, war, famine, plague, the sight of everyone dressed properly must have been soothing, like a visible prayer. Even absurdity can comfort when it's consistent. You imagine the town square on festival days, a mosaic of sanctioned color, red for authority, brown for humility, gray for poverty. Yet within that monotony, 1,000 quiet acts of defiance bloom. A lace cuff too fine, a thread too shiny, a feather too proud, each one a whisper of humanity saying, "I exist beyond my station." As evening falls, you watch the silhouettes of people moving through the amber haze, the flicker of torchlight catching on gold threads and hidden defiance. Somewhere, a minstrel plays a tune mocking a duke's ridiculous hat, and even the guards laugh softly. The laws might have drawn the lines, but laughter kept blurring them. You realize then that medieval fashion wasn't about vanity, it was survival with flair. To dress boldly in a world afraid of color was to declare your soul alive. The fabric of society, quite literally, was stitched with rebellion. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sensation of wearing forbidden velvet, the texture brushing your skin like a secret. You hear the faint rustle of skirts, the whisper of silk on stone, the heartbeat of identity trying to breathe through constraint. The scent of dye and sweat lingers in the air, strangely tender, strangely human. Perhaps that's what all these laws misunderstood, that the desire to adorn oneself is not vanity, but the oldest kind of prayer, a plea to be seen, to exist vividly before fading into the same dust as everyone else. And as the torches gutter and the stars rise over the crooked rooftops, you walk on, smiling at the thought that somewhere, even now, a peasant is quietly stitching a little gold into the hem of her apron, daring the world to notice. The night deepens around you, But this time, the darkness hums with a different kind of absurdity. The kind that wears fur, squeals, and occasionally eats garbage. You're standing in a small medieval square that smells of mud, manure, and misplaced morality. And at the center of it all is a wooden platform where something remarkable is about to happen. A pig is on trial. Yes, really. An actual pig, dressed in a small tunic tied with a rope, and guarded by two solemn men who look like they've been assigned the world's strangest duty. The crowd gathers, a murmur of excitement mixing with the wet snorts of the accused. Welcome to the surreal theater of medieval justice, where beasts stood before the bench as if reason could be weighed against instinct. You can almost taste the absurdity in the air, thick with smoke and roasted barley. The bailiff shouts for silence. The judge adjusts his robe. And you, standing at the edge of the crowd, realize that somewhere in this serious display of nonsense lies a story about the human need to make sense of chaos, even if it means punishing a goat. The historical records are quite clear on this point. Animal trials happened, often, and they were no joke. In the early 1400s, a sow in Falaise, Normandy, was hanged publicly for the crime of killing a child. She was dressed in human clothes for the occasion, a grotesque parody of justice, and the execution was attended by the local magistrates in full ceremonial robes. One chronicler even noted that the town reimbursed the hangman for a new pair of gloves so that he might not be polluted by the touch of the condemned. You let out a low whistle. Medieval logic could turn compassion into comedy in one breath. The scholars still argue whether these trials were genuine attempts at moral order or elaborate rituals meant to comfort the grieving and terrified. Was it faith or fear that made people demand a confession from a cow? Historians can't agree. Some see it as symbolic, an exorcism of guilt projected onto beasts. Others think it was simply legal, literalism gone feral. Either way, you can't help but imagine the paperwork. Charge: murder. Defendant: swine. Witnesses: several hysterical peasants. Somewhere, even the quills must have giggled. The crowd around you shifts as the prosecutor, a monk with a booming voice and an unfortunate haircut, begins his speech. He declares the pig guilty of unnatural behavior, unbefitting a creature of God's creation. You raise an eyebrow. What exactly would be fitting behavior for a pig? The spectators nod gravely, though one woman in the front keeps feeding crumbs to a chicken under her cloak, as if preparing a future defendant. A bell rings, the air fills with the smell of tallow and sweat, and you notice how eerily familiar it all feels, this mixture of outrage and entertainment. People have always loved justice most when it's public, especially when it isn't about them. The executioner yawns. The pig grunts. Somewhere a dog barks, possibly offering testimony. There are other cases too, whispered through centuries like dark jokes that no one quite stopped laughing at. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was burned at the stake for the crime of laying an egg. A biological impossibility turned theological scandal. The logic was flawless by medieval standards. An egg laid by a male chicken must surely belong to the devil. The rooster, naturally, offered no defense. You picture the scene: a priest sprinkling holy water on the bewildered bird, the crowd crossing themselves against spontaneous poultry sorcery. There's something tragic and comic all at once about it, a desperate need to impose meaning on mystery. And yet, even here, you sense an odd tenderness. The same society that executed chickens also baptized bells, blessed plows, and prayed for rain, as if heaven ran on local jurisdiction. Everything was alive, accountable, and under supervision. The world, in all its noise and danger, had to be tamed by ritual. The air smells of hay and candle smoke, and you walk closer to the platform where the pig's trial continues. The judge strokes his beard, frowning thoughtfully as if trying to recall the proper sentencing protocol for swine homicide. The pig's appointed lawyer. Yes, that was sometimes a thing. clears his throat and delivers a passionate defense. He argues that the accused acted according to its bestial nature without malice aforethought. The crowd nods approvingly. For a moment, it almost feels reasonable. You can't help but grin. It's like watching philosophy wrestle with bacon. The lawyer's words drift upward into the chill evening, mingling with the low hum of the crowd. Somewhere, a jester leans against a post, whispering to a friend, "If the pig wins, I'm appealing my own case." You turn your gaze toward the church across the square, where a mural depicts St. Anthony surrounded by animals, all looking absurdly well behaved. It's easy to forget that in the medieval mind, animals weren't just beasts. They were moral mirrors, stand-ins for human sin and virtue. A disobedient dog was an allegory for pride, a loyal ox for humility. The church saw the entire natural world as a moral text to be read, and when that text misbehaved, well, it had to be corrected. The scholars of theology still debate whether these trials were remnants of older pagan beliefs that beasts carried souls or that the devil could possess any living thing. Perhaps, beneath the Latin pomp and public laughter, there lingered an older fear that the line between man and beast was perilously thin. A cold breeze sweeps through the square, carrying the smell of wet straw. The judge finally pronounces the sentence, "The pig shall be hanged at dawn." The crowd murmurs approval. You half expect someone to shout, "Justice is served," and offer sausages. But no one does. The mood, oddly, turns solemn. The priest steps forward, muttering a prayer, sprinkling holy water that hisses as it hits the torchlight. For all its lunacy, the ritual feels sincere. It's grief wrapped in order, pain disguised as process. The people needed to believe that the world could be corrected, even if it meant pretending that morality had trotters. You find yourself oddly moved. Humans, you realize, will always build meaning where there's chaos, even if it means giving speeches to pigs. Later, as the crowd disperses, you wander through the muddy streets, your boots squelching in rhythm with your thoughts. The moonlight paints everything silver, turning puddles into tiny mirrors. You pass a tavern where two men are arguing about whether rats can be excommunicated. Apparently, there's precedent. In 1510, a French village actually summoned rats to court for destroying grain. When they failed to appear, their lawyer argued that they could not safely travel due to the presence of cats along the route. The judge, in his infinite mercy, granted a continuance. You laugh aloud, startling a passing horse. But it's the kind of laughter that carries both amusement and awe. These people weren't fools. They were inventors of logic under pressure, trying to negotiate fairness with the universe. When the world felt unpredictable, plague, famine, war, they built a courtroom where even chaos had to answer a summons. The air grows colder as you reach the edge of town. The fields beyond glisten with dew, the faint outline of the gallows silhouetted against the moon. Tomorrow, the pig will hang, and by next week, life will go on as if nothing happened. But the memory will linger, retold in whispers and laughter. Another tale in the long list of human attempts to balance the scales of absurdity. You wonder if anyone ever felt a pang of guilt, or if they believed the ritual truly worked, that by punishing the beast they cleansed the soul of the town. Historians still can't agree whether these trials were born from justice, theology, or pure theatrical instinct. Maybe they were all three. You pause and listen. The night is full of distant sounds, a donkey braying somewhere, an owl hooting like a judge clearing his throat, the faint creak of wood in the gallows frame. It's haunting and strangely peaceful. In this ridiculous, beautiful world, even cruelty has ceremony. You take one last look at the quiet square, where the torch smoke curls upward like prayers that forgot where to go. Then you turn away, your footsteps soft against the damp earth, thinking that perhaps the true trial wasn't of animals at all. It was of humanity itself, forever testing the limits of its own reason, forever finding new ways to call madness divine. The morning after the pig's hanging, the town smells of wet ashes and overboiled cabbage, and a pale mist curls along the rooftops like leftover guilt. You walk through the waking streets, past half-open shutters and sleepy merchants sweeping the cobblestones, until the soft clang of a distant bell threads through the fog. It's not a summons for court this time. It's the curfew bell rung backwards, a sound meant to remind everyone that night itself has rules. The curfew. They called it in Norman French, the cover fire law. When dusk fell, every hearth in the village had to be smothered, every candle pinched out, and every wandering soul returned indoors. It was fire prevention on paper, but in practice it felt more like bedtime for civilization. You can almost hear the collective sigh as each home surrendered to darkness, the final hiss of extinguished flame echoing like an obedient heartbeat. In some towns, the constable would walk street to street, checking windows for illegal glows, his lantern the only legal light after curfew. You imagine the tension of that moment, the urge to keep a small candle burning, to resist the suffocating quiet. And somewhere, you suspect, someone always did. Historians still argue whether these curfew laws were about public safety or public submission, whether they truly prevented fires or merely kept people too tired to rebel. Either way, the world after sundown belonged to the bells, and you can feel the weight of that obedience even now, centuries later. As evening falls again in your imagination, the town begins its slow metamorphosis. The market noise dies first, replaced by the sigh of shutters and the creak of cartwheels rolling home. Then comes the curfew bell, low and solemn, rippling through the smoky twilight like a command whispered by heaven itself. You watch as people hurry, clutching candles like guilty secrets, darting into doorways before the last toll fades. Somewhere, a dog barks, a tiny act of defiance, and is swiftly silenced by a thrown shoe. The street's empty until only the air remains, smelling of extinguished wicks, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of yeast still clinging to the baker's door. You stand beneath a crooked lantern post and feel how fragile civilization must have seemed when one stray spark could devour it all. Yet the ritual of darkness feels too strict, too choreographed to be just practical. There's a superstition beneath it, a whisper that the night itself was alive, that shadows housed restless spirits drawn to flame. People said that leaving a fire uncovered after curfew invited the wandering souls of the unshriven dead who would dance in the hearthlight and steal your breath as you slept. Children were told that if they disobeyed the curfew, they'd wake to find soot footprints leading to their bed. You smile at the absurdity, yet something in the chill air makes you shiver. The medieval world didn't just fear fire, it feared what light revealed. You picture a small cottage on the edge of town. Inside, a woman moves carefully, cupping her hand around a candle stub, whispering to it like an accomplice. She waits until the patrol passes before relighting it, the flame flickering with guilty warmth. Her husband mutters that it's not worth the risk, but she keeps the light anyway, murmuring that the Virgin watches kindly over those who work late. The candle flame bends, a tiny golden rebellion in a world obsessed with compliance. If caught, she could be fined, maybe spend a night in the stocks, publicly shamed for disorder of illumination. Yes, that was a real charge. You can almost hear the snicker of modernity from across the centuries, but to her, the danger is real. The constable's boots crunch outside. She presses her palm over the flame, the hot sting biting into her skin, the scent of melted wax mixing with fear. And yet, when he passes, she lifts her hand and lets the light live again. There's something achingly human about that, the refusal to let the world go completely dark. Elsewhere in the village, the church bell tolls its final note, the sound dissolving into the wind. A watchman lights his lantern from a single torch, one of the few sanctioned flames allowed after hours, and makes his rounds, tapping doors with his staff. All's well, he mutters, though his tone suggests otherwise. You follow him for a while, the glow of his light bouncing off puddles, each reflection trembling like a small soul trapped in glass. He pauses outside the tavern, listens for laughter, and frowns. Even muffled joy sounds suspicious at this hour. You realize that medieval night was more than darkness, it was surveillance by silence. To live under curfew was to surrender sound itself, to trade the right to sing for the right to wake up unpunished. You think of how quiet the world must have been, how enormous the stars must have felt when every human voice had to hide beneath a roof. There's a story, half folklore and half local gossip, of a tanner's apprentice who once lit his forge after curfew to finish a commission for a visiting knight. The next morning, the entire workshop was gone, burned to ash, and witnesses swore they'd seen dancing figures in the flames, long, spindly shapes with coals for eyes. The priests called them fire sprites, vengeful messengers sent by God to punish arrogance. The blackened ruins were left untouched for years, a kind of monument to the dangers of defiance. Whether it was poor luck or poor ventilation, no one could say. Historians, as usual, still debate whether such tales were cautionary propaganda or genuine belief. But the message was clear enough. Night was sacred, and the laws of darkness were not to be tested. You pause beneath a narrow archway as the wind stirs, carrying the faint clang of another bell from the next parish over. The rhythm feels ancient, almost comforting, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. There's a strange beauty to it, the way order becomes lullaby, fear becomes ritual. You can almost understand the appeal. In a time without clocks, the curfew bell divided life into chapters: labor, rest, survival. It told you when to stop, when to vanish, when to let the world breathe without you. And yet, as comforting as it sounds, it also caged imagination. What dreams could flourish in a town that outlawed candles? You picture poets whispering verses to the walls, scribes writing by moonlight, lovers meeting in barns because lanterns would betray them. Even rebellion had to whisper. A man passes by carrying a covered lantern, its glow dim and nervous. He nods to you, half apologetic, half proud of his sanctioned light. The smell of tallow follows him, a sharp, greasy perfume of authority. You think of how light itself became a symbol of privilege. Only guards, clergy, and the wealthy could lawfully illuminate the dark. For everyone else, obedience meant blindness. Yet, in every village, there were those who broke the rules, not out of malice but out of longing for warmth, for comfort, for one more page, one more song, one more moment of humanity. And perhaps that's why curfew laws lingered for centuries. They made rebellion as simple as keeping the fire alive. You close your eyes and imagine the soundscape of that world. The bell fades, crickets begin, the faint drip of water from the eaves. Then nothing. Perfect silence. The kind of silence so complete it becomes its own sound, pressing against your eardrums, reminding you that peace enforced is just fear with better manners. Somewhere, a child stirs, dreaming of stars. A mouse scurries across the hearth. The woman's hidden candle burns low, then gutters, leaving behind a ribbon of smoke that smells faintly like honey and defiance. You exhale, slow and steady, the air cool in your lungs. The medieval night has closed in completely now, tight, absolute, and absurdly human in its need to control what can't truly be contained. You think of all the fires that never burned, all the songs that never finished, all the kisses interrupted by the tolling of bells. When dawn finally breaks, it feels like forgiveness. The first rays of sunlight spill over the rooftops, soft and gold, igniting every chimney like a chorus of tiny victories. Doors open, shutters swing wide, and the town exhales. The watchmen yawn and stumble home, their lanterns flickering out one by one. The world smells of smoke, dew, and renewal. And as you stand in that pale morning glow, you realize that even in the most controlled of ages, Humanity always found a way to outshine its own restrictions. The candle may have been outlawed, but the sunrise never was. Do you wake into a medieval morning thick with incense and gossip, where the smell of fresh bread mingles with something sharper? Perfume, expectation, and a faint trace of moral supervision. Bells ring somewhere in the distance, not to announce curfew this time, but confession, because today the church courts are open for business, and they've got a new crime wave to tackle: affection. You wander through the square and see the crowd gathering near the ecclesiastical hall, a timbered building that looks half holy, half bureaucratic. Inside, parchment crackles like dry leaves, ink stains the desks, and a clerk in a brown robe adjusts his spectacles, ready to catalog sins like items at market. You can almost taste the air: parchment dust, candle smoke, and sanctified judgment. This is where love is taxed, where kisses have prices, and where the words "for God's sake" are used as opening statements. Historians note, because historians always note, that church courts handled everything from adultery to gossip, and that fines for inappropriate gestures of affection were as common as dandelions in spring. A husband caught kissing his wife in public might pay a penny for impropriety, while an unmarried couple sharing a bench could be charged twice that for moral confusion. You stifle a laugh, imagining the accountant of righteousness balancing ledgers of lust. You step inside, and the scent of beeswax and anxiety greets you. A young man stands before the bench, hat in hand, mumbling that he didn't know kissing during Lent was forbidden. The priest sighs, fingers steepled as though holding up the weight of the world's hormones. Ignorance, he declares, is not absolution. The scribe scratches this down, the quill squeaking like a rat in a pantry. The fine, 3 pence and a prayer for chastity. Behind him, a woman blushes so hard you can almost feel the heat radiating. Her crime? Dancing too closely at a harvest feast. Somewhere in the back, a grandmother clucks her tongue, half scandalized, half nostalgic. You sense that everyone, from the bishop to the baker, secretly enjoys the theater of it all. Moral control has never been so entertaining, and yet, beneath the laughter, there's something weary in the air. People know these fines aren't really about sin, they're about authority. Historians still argue whether church courts existed to uphold virtue or simply to keep everyone's behavior economically measurable. Moral economy, they call it, the strange medieval practice of assigning prices to emotions. You find yourself wondering what a heartbeat costs. Outside, the sunlight feels almost guilty, filtered through stained glass that paints the street in bands of blood red and heaven blue. You pass a notice board covered with parchment fines: 5 pence for a kiss without betrothal, 10 for touching hands in the market, 20 for indecent proximity during vespers. You smirk: 20 pence for a warm shoulder in a cold church. Not bad considering. A merchant nearby complains loudly that these moral taxes are ruining romance. If they start charging for daydreams, he mutters, we'll all be bankrupt. His wife elbows him, but you see her smile. Humor, you realize, is the only tax-free sin left. The church may have written the rules, but laughter keeps rewriting them. A gust of wind carries the sound of a wedding bell from the next parish over, a distant chime that feels both romantic and bureaucratic. You follow it down an alley that smells of roses and damp stone. There, beneath an archway, 2 lovers whisper urgently, the kind of conversation that glows brighter than daylight. If the priest sees us, it's another fine. The girl murmurs, but she leans closer anyway. Their hands meet softly, guiltily, and you feel the tension of centuries compressed in that simple touch. There's something sacred about it, more honest than any sermon. The boy laughs under his breath. Then let him charge me double. The sound of his laughter lingers in the air like perfume, defiant and fleeting. You step past, pretending not to notice, but their bravery warms you. Every era has its rebels. Sometimes they just hold hands instead of swords. You wander toward the church square, where a friar preaches about temptation to an audience of half-listeners. His voice rises and falls like a wave of guilt. The body, he says, is but a vessel of sin, unless ruled by virtue. You look around and realize most people are nodding politely while sneaking glances at one another. A butcher winks at the miller's daughter. Two widows whisper about whose husband confessed what. The irony thickens until it's almost visible. You catch snippets of old folklore drifting through the sermon, that sneezing was once a sinful reflex, an unguarded expulsion of the soul, and that holding hands could tangle spirits. People cross themselves as he speaks, but their minds are elsewhere, probably replaying the last time they sinned in detail. You chuckle quietly. Medieval piety had rules for everything except how to stop being human. Later, you find yourself in a tavern, the air buzzing with ale, music, and the smell of spiced pork. The conversation at the next table drifts between gossip and confession. A blacksmith brags about paying off his flirtation fine by repairing the church gate, while a weaver jokes that he'll soon need a payment plan for his thoughts. Someone starts singing a bawdy tune about St. Agnes's patience, and everyone joins in until the tavern keeper shushes them. Careful, he warns. The church clerk drinks here too. Laughter ripples through the room, and you feel the same sly warmth you've seen everywhere today. Rebellion disguised as mirth. The medieval world may have been ruled by the cross, but it survived by the wink. You step back outside as the sun dips low, painting the town gold. The air smells of hay, sweat, and roasting meat. Somewhere a bell rings again. Vespers now, the hour of prayer. Couples part ways reluctantly. Doors close. You picture the priest counting coins from the day's moral harvest, his fingers smudged with ink and irony. And yet, in all this nonsense, there's a strange sort of order. The fines, the rules, the whispered excuses, they kept the chaos of love contained, made it legible. In a world terrified of unpredictability, even affection had to follow protocol. But you know better. You can feel the pulse of resistance beating beneath every rule, the shared laughter that says, we obey in public but not in private. As night settles, the streets quiet, except for the faint murmur of prayers spilling from windows. You pass a chapel where candles flicker like nervous hearts. A monk inside is reciting penances, 10 Hail Marys for stolen kisses, 20 for indecent thoughts, 1 for every night you dream of someone you shouldn't. The rhythm of repentance is hypnotic, like rain tapping on wood. You lean against the doorway, thinking how beautiful it sounds, this symphony of guilt and hope, of people trying to negotiate with their own humanity. There's an old superstition, whispered by midwives, that if two lovers are fined unjustly, their next kiss erases the debt in heaven's ledger. You imagine how many must have tested that theory under moonlight, their laughter echoing against the stone. The historians still argue whether fines for affection actually reduced sin or just increased creativity. But as you breathe in the cool night air, you know the answer. Rules never stop love, they just give it better hiding places. The bells toll once more, slow and drowsy, and you smile at the absurdity of it all. How an entire civilization tried to invoice emotion and ended up writing poetry instead. The scent of candle wax drifts on the wind, the stars blink awake, and you realize the medieval world was never as joyless as it pretended. Behind every law was a laugh, behind every sin a story, and behind every fine for kissing someone still leaning in. The tavern door swings open, and you're hit with the perfume of chaos, wood smoke, yeast, sweat, and something faintly medicinal that might once have been ale. You step into the hum of laughter, song, and a dozen simultaneous arguments about everything from saints to sheep. This is the alehouse, the medieval heartbeat of rebellion, and tonight it's louder than the church bells. A man strums a lute badly in the corner, a woman stamps her foot in rhythm, and 2 apprentices are locked in a very serious debate over which saint most appreciates beer. You find a seat near the hearth, where the air smells thick with malt and secrets. Here, gossip is currency, ale is confession, and laughter is a kind of resistance. There's a reason authorities feared these places. They weren't just drinking holes, they were thinking holes, bubbling with unlicensed ideas. You can almost hear the clerks outside sharpening their quills, ready to file tomorrow's fines. Historically, alehouses were so influential that they required official licensing, and in the 14th century the crown began issuing certificates of honest brewing to ensure no one watered the faith or the beer. You can imagine the inspector arriving with a solemn face, lifting a mug like a relic and declaring, "This one passes for now." The air smells like barley and bureaucracy. Somewhere in the corner, a man mutters that the inspectors only visit taverns they like, which, by coincidence, are always the ones with better cheese. You grin. It's the oldest joke in governance, corruption seasoned with cream. But beyond the humor lies fear. Every alehouse was a potential parliament, every toast a disguised protest. Historians still argue whether the crown regulated brewing for health or control, but most agree that taverns brewed more than ale. They brewed opinion. You sipped the frothy stuff in your imagination, thick, warm, a little sour, and it slides down like liquid courage. Around you, conversations bloom like mushrooms. A mason complains about taxes, a widow mocks the bishop's new hat, a soldier sings a tune about a nobleman's misplaced trousers. Even the serving girl, balancing mugs, tosses in a wry comment about virtue being thirsty work. The laughter that follows feels electric. Somewhere, deep in the candlelit haze, the medieval world stops pretending to be obedient. Here, under the roof of good cheer, truth gets a little drunk and dares to speak. You notice a small sign above the bar, a carved wooden plaque reading "No unlawful songs." You smirk. The irony is intoxicating. One by one, patrons take turns breaking that rule, singing verses that grow bolder with every round. One song mocks the local magistrate for marrying his cousin twice by accident. Another praises ale as the only honest sermon. Even the innkeeper joins in, his voice gravelly but proud. You think of how fragile authority must have felt in a place like this, where laughter stripped titles and toasts turned peasants into poets. The scholars who pore over these things still debate whether taverns were breeding grounds of dissent or simply sanctuaries for exhaustion. Maybe both. Maybe rebellion begins not in battlefields but in moments when ordinary people stop whispering and start singing. Outside, the church bell tolls the hour, but no one moves. Time behaves differently here. The candles have burned low, dripping wax like slow applause, and the air is thick with a kind of joy that feels almost dangerous. A man at your table leans close and tells a story about a brewer fined for selling ale too strong. The punishment? To drink his own stock until he couldn't stand. He survived, the man says proudly, but he's never been sober since. You laugh until your ribs ache, the kind of laughter that scrubs away centuries. In another corner, two women whisper about a neighbor fined for gossiping too loudly, then immediately resume gossiping about her punishment. You can't help but marvel at the human capacity for hypocrisy so cozy it feels like home. There's an unwritten law here, older than any decree. What's said in the alehouse stays in the alehouse, unless it's too good not to repeat. The noise ebbs and flows like a tide, conversations colliding, jokes mutating mid-air. You catch fragments of medieval wisdom drifting past. Never trust a sober monk. A dry throat is a sin against nature. If the king taxes laughter next, I'll cry for free. It's absurd and brilliant, and so alive you can almost see the steam of breath weaving between words. You take another imaginary sip, and the taste carries more than barley. It carries defiance. At one point, a friar enters, face tight with disapproval, his robe brushing the dirty floor like a broom of judgment. The room quiets, pretending piety. He orders a small ale for medicinal purposes, and within minutes is singing louder than anyone else. The crowd cheers, and you realize that even virtue likes to get tipsy sometimes. Outside, a watchman pauses, hears the laughter, and shakes his head. The tavern is technically within the law, but everyone knows it's a loophole made of wood and courage. These walls have heard confessions the church never could, forgiven sins the court would never dare. A cold draught sneaks through the cracks, carrying the smell of rain. The fire crackles. A cat stretches near the hearth, and for a moment the whole world feels condensed into this smoky golden glow. The sound of mugs clinking becomes a kind of music, rhythmic and communal. You think of how, in times of famine, plague or war, taverns stayed open like stubborn hearts, pulsing against despair. The size of ale may have set the price of drink, but not the price of laughter. As the night deepens, the songs soften into murmurs, the arguments into sighs. Someone tells a story about a king disguised as a peasant visiting a tavern to learn humility, only to be thrown out for not paying. Everyone roars, and you join them. The air tastes like smoke, salt, and relief. You realize that taverns were the lungs of medieval life, where people exhaled the pressure of obedience and breathed in something dangerously close to freedom. The church could tax sin, the king could find speech, but no one could outlaw laughter. When the final candle gutters out, you step outside into the cool night. The rain has started, thin and cleansing, washing the dust from the cobbles. Behind you the door closes, muffling the last ripple of song. The air smells new, wet stone and ale and hope. You glance back once more and imagine the world without that noise, without the stubborn joy that refused to die even under curfew, even under law. And as you walk away through the sleeping streets, you can still hear faint echoes of clinking mugs and mischievous songs, like the heartbeat of a people who, no matter how many rules they lived under, never truly stopped toasting life itself. The smell of spilled ale still lingers on your clothes as you step out into the daylight again, but this time the wind carries something different: rot, river water, and a faint whiff of civic pride. You're walking through the narrow arteries of a medieval town that's trying very badly to stay clean. Filth is everywhere. Ruts of mud, piles of straw, the polite euphemism of night soil waiting patiently in buckets for someone to remember it exists. You pass a boy sloshing a pail into the gutter, the splash landing just inches from your boots, and he grins at an apology that isn't really an apology. This is the living, breathing contradiction of medieval life: salvation on Sunday, sewage on Monday. And yet, amid the mess, there are rules, actual laws about where and when one can dump, sweep, or sneeze. Civic ordinances written in Latin, so stern they could make dirt feel self-conscious. In 1357, London decreed that no one should throw refuse into the streets or the Thames under penalty of fine. The city clerk must have choked on his quill writing it, because the same law had to be reissued almost every year for the next 2 centuries. Historians still argue whether these regulations were genuine efforts at hygiene or just wishful thinking carved into parchment. The medieval mind didn't separate cleanliness from morality. Filth wasn't just bad for the body, it was bad for the soul. You walk past the tanner's quarter where the smell hits like a sermon. Animal hides stretch on racks, dripping their ghostly fluids into the dirt. Flies buzz like gossip. Somewhere nearby, a butcher's apprentice scrapes fat off a table, whistling through the stink. Yet even here, there's order. The scavenger's ordinance dictates that every citizen must sweep the street before their house once a week, or face public shaming. You picture the city bailiff inspecting gutters, pointing accusingly at a particularly rebellious cabbage leaf. Medieval life was full of such absurd practicalities, where civic virtue was measured in broom strokes. The irony, of course, is that half the population still emptied chamber pots directly into the road. The sound of it, splash, sigh, move on, was as common as birdsong. You can almost hear the rhythm of it between cartwheels and prayers. There's a superstition that lingers even in the stench. People believed demons lived in filth. The Black Death hadn't yet taught them about fleas, but the idea that rot attracted evil was gospel. One chronicler wrote that the devil preferred unclean corners, especially beneath beds or behind privies. Mothers told their children to keep their rooms tidy or risk summoning spirits of the dunghill. You imagine how terrifyingly motivating that must have been. Somewhere between hygiene and exorcism, cleanliness became divine diplomacy, but even that had limits. A monk once wrote that too much washing was vanity. The devil apparently admired smooth skin, and so for every ordinance demanding clean streets, there was a sermon warning against bathing more than once a week. Contradiction was the soap of the Middle Ages. It lathered everywhere, never fully cleaned anything, and smelled faintly of penance. You turn a corner and find yourself by the town well, where women chatter as they draw water. The rope creaks, buckets slosh, and gossip flows faster than the stream. One woman complains that her neighbor's pigs keep using her doorway as a latrine. Another swears she saw the bailiff himself dump ashes behind the church. If sin had a smell, one of them says, it would be his boots. The laughter that follows is the kind that keeps civilizations from collapsing entirely. You watch as they scrub clothes with lye soap, the air foamy with effort, their knuckles raw but proud. The town's ordinance on common washing forbids bathing livestock in the same troughs as linen, though the sheep grazing nearby look unconvinced. A rooster crows, loud and offended, as if protesting municipal incompetence. By midday, the heat intensifies the stench into something almost holy. Every breath is a pilgrimage. You pass a notice nailed to a post. Those who throw filth before their neighbors' doors shall pay a fine of 2 pennies. Someone has drawn a smiling face next to it, probably the same person who will ignore it tonight. You can't help but laugh. It's humanity distilled. Legislate against yourself, then immediately disobey. Yet there's progress here too. Some towns appointed gong farmers, professional collectors of waste, who trudged through the night with carts and buckets, singing low songs to keep the fear away. They were paid well but lived lonely, invisible lives. Historians still debate whether the term gong came from the sound or the smell, but either way, you wouldn't want it on your business card. As you move toward the river, the air shifts, wet, mossy, slightly less murderous. The Thames, or its smaller cousin, winds through the town like an artery clogged with mystery. Boats float lazily, carrying grain, goods, and, occasionally, things best not described. The same water that brews ale also receives chamber pots, and no one sees the irony. Children splash in the shallows. A priest blesses the stream with holy water, trying to outbless its contents. You feel a pang of admiration for their optimism. Medieval sanitation wasn't ignorance, it was endurance. To survive this smell was to prove your soul's toughness. And yet, for all the chaos, there's beauty here too. The sunlight turns puddles into tiny mirrors. The damp air carries the sound of church bells mingled with laughter. A boy runs past barefoot, dragging a broom twice his size, shouting that he's saving the town from demons. You grin. Maybe he's right. Every sweep of that broom is an act of defiance, a declaration that even if the world is filthy, we can still pretend it's manageable. Somewhere behind you, a woman tosses a bucket out her window and shouts, "Mind your head," a timeless courtesy. As dusk approaches, the air cools and the scent softens. Candles flicker in windows, their glow gentle against the grime. The sweepers make their final rounds, muttering about fines, and the town seems to exhale. For a brief moment, everything smells almost clean. You realize, standing there, that cleanliness in the Middle Ages wasn't about hygiene. It was about hope. The ordinances, the fines, the futile brooms, all of it was humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender to chaos. The scholars who study this world still argue whether medieval sanitation was primitive or profound, but you suspect it was both. The people didn't need sterile streets. They needed the illusion that order could exist even for an hour. You take one last deep breath, air thick with dirt and dignity, and smile. In a world where even angels avoided muddy roads, someone still took the time to sweep. The bells are ringing again, but this time their rhythm feels hungry. You follow the sound through streets that smell of smoke and fasting, into a season that the medieval calendar knew by heart, Lent, that long gray corridor between appetite and forgiveness. Everywhere, the air seems thinner, as if even oxygen has been rationed. A fishmonger's stall buzzes with flies, and beside it a butcher's door is barred shut until Easter. You can almost hear the collective growl of a town trying not to eat. This is not simple piety. This is law. The church's calendar governs every mouth, turning hunger into holiness and dinner into doctrine. You pass a baker's window where loaves grow smaller by the day, the scent of flour mingled with resignation. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that fasting was mandatory on certain days, and so entire towns rearranged their biology to fit divine scheduling. Historians still argue whether these rules were about discipline or supply management, about saving souls or saving fish. Whatever the truth, it meant that your stomach became part of the legal system. Every bite carried moral weight. You wander through the market square, where vendors now sell penitence by the pound. Salted herring, dried peas, barley gruel, Lent's official menu. The air tastes like ash and vinegar. A woman in a headscarf stirs a pot of something suspiciously green, muttering that even the Lord must get tired of beans. Behind her, a friar lectures about abstinence, his voice rising above the hiss of the cauldron. Flesh, he declares, is temptation. You can't help but smirk. Half the crowd is made of butchers listening with their arms crossed. They know these sermons by heart. Somewhere someone jokes that fasting only makes sin leaner, not smaller. The laughter ripples like a suppressed burp. The friar scowls, but even he knows the hypocrisy of the season. Rumor has it that certain monasteries treated fasting like a loophole buffet, redefining meat as cold-blooded indulgence so they could eat beaver tails on Fridays. You can almost see the scholars centuries later, eyebrows raised, debating whether that counted as aquatic morality or culinary genius. A breeze carries the smell of smoked fish past you, oily and sharp, the medieval perfume of obedience. It clings to everything. Clothes, breath, conscience. You pass a tavern where the door is half open, and the laughter inside sounds guilty. Inside, a group of men hunch over bowls of soup, too hearty to be legal. One of them raises a spoonful and whispers, "It's broth, not beef," before swallowing. The others cross themselves in jest. You laugh quietly. Rebellion, it seems, always begins at the dinner table. Even the strictest priest must have bent the rules when no one was looking. The records mention countless fines for unholy consumption, but rarely a confession that stuck. You can imagine a bishop wagging his finger by day, then sneaking eggs by candlelight. The human stomach, you realize, has always been the last to convert. The church didn't only police what you ate, it policed when meatless Wednesdays, fish-filled Fridays, fasting vigils before every feast. The year was a carousel of cravings, and every turn came with instructions. But here's the irony. The more restrictions they imposed, the more creative people became. Housewives invented mock meats, pious disguises for forbidden joy, almond paste shaped into chicken legs, figs sculpted like sausages, even eels baked into something politely called poor man's beef. The result was culinary theater, holiness in drag. You can almost taste the ingenuity, faintly sweet, faintly guilty. Historians still debate whether these recipes were resistance or reverence, whether people mocked the law or simply made it palatable. Either way, Lent turned kitchens into laboratories of loopholes. As you walk, the afternoon light fades into the dusty blue of self-denial. The town feels quieter, thinner. Bells toll again, this time for vespers, their echoes rippling through the smoky air like a prayer for patience. A child tugs his mother's sleeve, asking when Easter will come, and she whispers, "Soon, love, soon." You can hear the weariness beneath it. Fasting wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The absence of feasts made the days longer, the nights heavier. People spoke more softly, moved more slowly. Even laughter felt rationed. Somewhere in the distance a dog howls, probably smelling a forbidden stew, and the irony makes you smile again. You stop near the church steps, where a priest is blessing baskets of salt and herbs, his breath visible in the chill. The congregation waits solemnly, their stomachs empty but their eyes bright. For all its absurdities, there's something profoundly communal in this hunger. The shared deprivation binds people tighter than any feast could. You catch the scent of wax and rosemary as the candles are lit, the glow reflecting off worn faces that still manage to look serene. This is faith turned into rhythm. Starve, pray, forgive, repeat. A merchant beside you whispers that he's never missed a Lent in 20 years but dreams nightly of roasted goose. You grin. Holiness, it seems, always comes with cravings. But not everyone obeys. There are stories whispered by candlelight of bakers who smuggled meat pies beneath fish crusts, of nobles who declared fasting exemptions for medical necessity. In one village, the legend goes, a man was fined for roasting a hare on a Friday, then fined again for trying to eat it too quickly before being caught. His defense? "I was purging temptation." The magistrate, reportedly, agreed to halve the fine for creativity. Somewhere, you suspect, the scribe was laughing too hard to write it down properly. And then there's the darker superstition that hovers beneath the surface, that eating meat on holy days didn't just offend heaven, it invited disaster. Old wives whispered that forbidden flesh carried curses, that blood eaten on a Friday might curdle in your veins or make your dreams turn red. Some swore that those who broke fast would see ghosts of the animals they'd eaten, waiting at their door with mournful eyes. The scholars dismiss it as folklore, but you can feel the chill of belief even now, the way guilt can turn supper into seance. The medieval mind lived in a world where food and fear were one. You keep walking until the town thins into fields, where smoke from cottage chimneys rises like thin prayers. Somewhere, a family sits around a wooden table, heads bowed, sharing their humble meal of porridge and onions. The father murmurs grace, the mother divides the last crust of bread, and for a moment everything is perfectly balanced: law, love, hunger, faith. You can smell the simplicity of it, honest and aching. Fasting, you realize, wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was survival dressed as devotion. The scholars who argue about motives miss the point entirely. For people who lived so close to the edge of hunger, the church's calendar gave their emptiness a name, a purpose, a promise that restraint might lead to redemption. As night settles, you feel the strange serenity of a world at half speed. The stars emerge, cold and clear, and the wind carries the faintest scent of cooking fires, the ones still allowed. Somewhere, a monk hums a hymn that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby for the stomach. You smile in the dark, knowing that come Easter, this same town will explode in feasting, the bells ringing like laughter set free. Until then, everyone waits together, hungry, holy, and human. The moon hangs low over the village like a tarnished coin, and the air smells of iron and rain, a fitting scent for a world about to test the soul through fire and water. You walk toward the square where a crowd is gathering around something that looks like both a ritual and a crime scene: the ordeal. It's part trial, part miracle, part very bad science experiment. And tonight the question is simple: will God save the accused, or will physics do what physics always does? The Church claims this is divine arbitration, justice purified through pain. The peasants just call it Tuesday. In one corner, a priest sprinkles holy water over a cauldron that's boiling like judgment itself. Beside it stands a woman accused of theft, her hands trembling not from guilt but from the certainty of what's about to happen. The rule is clear. She must plunge her arm into the cauldron and retrieve a stone from the bottom. If her burns heal cleanly in 3 days, she's innocent. If not, she's guilty and probably bandaged by someone who will gossip about it later. The logic is flawless. If God controls all things, he surely moonlights as a forensic pathologist. The fire pops, the crowd murmurs, and the woman's face glows in the shifting light. You can almost feel the heat pressing against your skin. Smell the fat of the candles mixing with the acrid tang of iron. A friar chants softly, Latin syllables blending with the hiss of the cauldron until you can't tell where faith ends and steam begins. She lowers her hand, a collective gasp rises, and you realize that this moment, terrifying, theatrical, utterly sincere, is how justice once felt, immediate, holy, and completely unfair. Historians still argue whether ordeals were superstition or social control, whether people truly believed in divine verdicts or simply feared what would happen if they didn't. Some scholars say the rituals worked not by miracle but by psychology. The guilty confessed before the test. The innocent were steady enough to survive. You can't help but admire the twisted genius of it, a trial so cruel it often prevented itself. Across the square, another court is in session. The ordeal by water. A wooden platform has been built over the pond, slick with moonlight. The accused, a man charged with witchcraft, stands barefoot, clutching a cross he doesn't seem to believe in. The logic here runs backward. Pure water, being incorruptible, rejects evil. If he floats, he's guilty. If he sinks, he's innocent but drowned. You watch as they tie his hands and feet, muttering prayers that sound more like disclaimers. The rope creaks, the crowd leans forward, and he plunges with a splash that echoes off the stone walls. For a moment he floats guilty, by buoyancy. Someone cheers, someone crosses themselves, and you feel a shiver crawl down your spine. Historians still debate whether people actually thought this worked. You whisper to yourself, but the crowd isn't listening. They already have their answer. The water ripples, reflecting the torchlight like 100 watching eyes. The priest nods gravely. The bailiff looks satisfied. In a few hours they'll haul the man's body out, whispering that justice has been served. The smell of wet wood and smoke thickens as you wander away from the pond, past the line of torches sputtering in the wind. It's hard not to see the absurd poetry of it all. People begging heaven for clarity while standing knee-deep in mud. Somewhere nearby, a drunk grins and mutters, "If God's the judge, he should at least show up." You laugh despite yourself. The irony is too rich to ignore. The scholars of canon law called ordeals judicium Dei, the judgment of God, but it often looked more like the judgment of weather, gravity, and luck. And yet people found comfort in it. The spectacle turned fear into ceremony, chaos into choreography. Every trial by ordeal was theater for a world that didn't yet trust reason but desperately needed closure. You stop at a wooden scaffold where tools of justice hang in neat rows, a branding iron, a pair of tongs, a rusty chain. Each one gleams faintly in the torchlight, relics of a faith that believed pain could reveal truth. A young boy stares at them wide-eyed, clutching his mother's skirt. "Will they use those tomorrow?" he asks. She hushes him but doesn't answer. You can smell the oil on the metal, sharp and metallic, mingling with the sweet rot of hay. It's an olfactory sermon about power. Who holds the heat decides who is pure. You find yourself wondering what it must have felt like to live in a time when pain was proof and silence was suspicious. There's another kind of ordeal. Quieter but no less cruel. The ordeal of the cross. Two men stand before the altar, arms outstretched, forced to hold them that way for hours. The one who lowers his arms first loses the case. You picture them trembling, sweat pooling on the stone floor. The audience watching with morbid patience. It's like divine arm wrestling, except the prize is absolution. You can't help but grin at the absurdity. Somewhere an angel must have face-palmed. Yet behind the humor, there's something hauntingly human about it. The need for certainty makes people invent rituals, and when logic fails, they turn to spectacle. You step closer to the fire again, drawn by its warmth despite what it represents. The embers hiss and crackle, and you see the priest testing the temperature with a stick, a surprisingly unholy gesture. Hot enough, he murmurs. The next ordeal begins, this one by hot iron. The accused must carry a glowing bar 3 paces without crying out. The smell of scorched wood mixes with something darker, and the crowd holds its breath. The iron is lifted from the flames, its surface red and trembling, a miniature sunrise in the priest's hands. You feel your stomach tighten. The accused, a blacksmith, fittingly, takes the iron and walks. His face is unreadable, his silence absolute. The crowd exhales when he drops it at the 3rd step. His hands blister immediately, but the priest declares that judgment will come in 3 days when the wounds either heal cleanly or fester with guilt. You think of how many infections were mistaken for divine messages. And yet, for all the brutality, there's a strange elegance to the ritual. The way it weaves belief and biology together into one story. Fire and flesh, water and fear, all orchestrated to reveal invisible truth. It's science without data, theology without mercy. But to them, it was order. It meant that even in chaos, someone somewhere was keeping score. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed in these tests or whether they simply feared what would happen if they refused. You suspect the answer lies somewhere between faith and survival. In a world that burned easily and healed slowly, sometimes pretending that pain had purpose was the only way to stay sane. As the night deepens, the square empties, the fires die down to dull embers, the pond lies still, and the smell of iron lingers in the damp air. A priest extinguishes the last torch and murmurs a prayer that sounds more tired than holy. The accused lie in their homes, their bandages stiff, their fates sealed by tomorrow's infection. You watch the smoke rise into the cold sky and wonder whether God ever cringed at these performances carried out in His name. Probably not. Divinity, like justice, has always depended on distance. You take one last look at the scorched ground, where the footprints of the innocent and the guilty look exactly the same, and you realize that every civilization builds its own version of this test. Maybe ours just calls it something different. The wind shifts, carrying the fading scent of ash and sweat, and for a fleeting moment the world feels both wiser and sadder, knowing that pain was once mistaken for truth and that, somehow, everyone slept better for believing it. The next scene opens at dawn, and this time the air hums with a faint metallic tang. The smell of iron and incense, sweat and sanctity, the daily perfume of a society obsessed with how loudly it lived and how neatly it shaved. You walk through the crooked streets of a town that legislates everything from bells to beards. A monk with a hammer is climbing a ladder to silence a chapel chime that dares to ring 2 seconds off schedule while a barber sets out his razor like a priest preparing for Mass. Welcome to the world of grooming and sound regulation, where holiness had decibels and masculinity had taxes. The year is somewhere between superstition and reason, and the rules are as sharp as the blades. You can almost hear them. No bells before prime, no stubble past Sunday. No laughter during matins. The smell of soap, olive oil and lye cuts through the morning damp as men shuffle toward the barber's stall, faces solemn as penitents. One of them mutters that the new beard ordinance is an abomination. The other replies that it's cheaper than damnation. It's true, beards could get you fined. In Tudor England, the so-called beard tax took root. an idea so absurd that historians still debate whether it was fiscal satire or royal vanity disguised as policy. In earlier centuries, a similar spirit ruled the continent. Certain towns required facial conformity, a clean chin on Sundays to signify inner purity. In others, only married men could wear full beards, lest bachelors look too worldly. You picture the chaos on Mondays, half the town scratching and pretending to be moral. There's even a story, half rumor, half miracle, that a priest once refused communion to a man whose beard was longer than a finger's width, claiming it might harbor demons. The scholars roll their eyes, but you can almost smell the superstition, a mixture of sanctity and sweat. The barber shop, such as it is, doubles as a minor operating theater. The chair creaks, the blade glints, and a bucket of water waits nearby, dark with yesterday's faith. The barber hums a hymn as he shaves, each stroke a quiet sermon on order. Outside, bells begin to ring again, carefully measured, legally allowed, because sound, too, is policed. Medieval Europe ran on bells. They marked prayer, work, curfew, even curds and whey. So much so that towns had ordinances about who could ring, when, and for how long. In some parishes, bells were taxed by tone. The heavier the sound, the holier the price. You can hear it now, a chorus of bronze voices scolding the morning, their echoes bouncing off stone walls and goats alike. Somewhere a peasant groans, pulling a blanket over his head, muttering that even God must hate Mondays. The irony is that bells were both sacred and suspect. Too many chimes could be considered pride, too few, neglect. There's a record of a town fined for ringing its bells too joyfully during Lent, as if happiness itself were noise pollution. You chuckle softly. History never changes. Every age invents its own volume control. The smell of smoke drifts from a smithy nearby, where the clamor of hammers competes with the choir of bells. The air vibrates with purpose and petty legislation. Somewhere, a clerk sits copying the Statute of Sound, a real enough idea in some city charters, detailing which noises were fit for civilization. Roosters, tolerated; barking dogs, finable; unlicensed drummers, heretical. A man walks past with a beard so magnificent it deserves a sermon. Children stare, women giggle behind sleeves, and an officer of the watch stops him to ask whether he's paid his fee. The man produces a parchment stamped with a seal and says, "My beard serves the Lord." The officer nods gravely. You laugh out loud, startling a pigeon that was probably violating some ordinance of its own. The scholars who write about this era still debate whether these beard rules were genuinely enforced or simply moral theater, but you can see the logic beneath the lunacy. In a world built on hierarchy, hair and sound were visible, audible class lines. A noble's beard meant authority. A peasant's meant defiance. The bell that summoned prayer could also summon obedience. Control the noise, control the people. By noon, the town hums like an orchestra of obedience. Bells ring, razors scrape. The rhythm of regulation is almost beautiful. Then, inevitably, someone ruins it. Down by the river, a group of apprentices have tied bells to a pig and are parading it through the streets, laughing as it jingles in time with their drinking song. The crowd howls with laughter until a constable appears, notebook in hand, already calculating the fines. "Unauthorized bell use," he mutters, 2 pence each. The apprentices bow dramatically, declaring that the pig was seeking salvation. You imagine the clerk writing that down with a sigh, the margins of his ledger full of miracles. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there's poetry. Bells were heartbeat. Beard was banner. They marked identity in a world where individuality was dangerous. The monk with a tonsure, the knight with a trimmed jawline, the widow who kept her husband's shaving bowl as relic, each carried meaning as rich as any relic in a shrine. Even silence was political. To stay unshaven during plague years was a sign of mourning. To ring a bell too soon after curfew was defiance. The line between devotion and disorder was drawn in stubble and sound. Evening settles slowly, the sky bruised with twilight. You can smell roast meat and wet stone, hear the last bells calling compline. The barbers pack up their razors, the priests count the chimes. Somewhere a man sharpens his blade against a whetstone, its hiss blending with the low toll of iron. For a moment the town sounds almost peaceful, a harmony of clatter and prayer. You close your eyes and imagine it. A world where justice sang and vanity had taxes, where holiness was measured in hair's breadths and decibels. The absurdity should make you laugh, but instead it feels strangely intimate. Every rule, no matter how ridiculous, was an attempt to carve order out of chaos, to remind people that even the hum of a bell or the curl of a beard could tether them to something larger than fear. The final bell tolls, long and low, echoing down the street like a sigh. The sound fades into the hush of evening, leaving only the faint scrape of a barber's broom and the lingering scent of oil and iron. Somewhere, someone is already breaking tomorrow's law, letting his beard grow through the night, daring the world to notice. The dawn arrives soft and golden, but beneath its beauty lies a quiet absurdity, the kind of order that only a civilization obsessed with punishment could invent. You walk through the narrow lanes of a medieval town, waking to the clatter of shutters, the clang of church bells, and the faint, inevitable scent of money being counted in the name of morality. This is the world of joy, fines, and sin taxes, where happiness costs extra, laughter requires a receipt, and the church keeps the best accountant heaven ever produced. The market square is alive already, vendors setting up stalls beneath banners that remind citizens of their moral dues, excess merriment subject to penalty. The ink has barely dried on the latest ordinance, decreed by a bishop who looks like he hasn't smiled since the last crusade. You breathe in the morning, smoke from hearths, roasted nuts, and the crisp undertone of bureaucracy. People move quietly today, careful not to seem too cheerful. Somewhere a child giggles, and his mother hushes him as if joy might summon divine taxation. The idea of sin taxes began, according to the historians, as an effort to temper temptation, fines on luxury goods, gambling, drunkenness, even laughter in public taverns after curfew. But like all good intentions, it quickly became a ledger of contradictions. You can imagine the clerks in their dusty offices, quills scratching away, recording crimes of excess with the same precision they used for rainfall and plague. One laugh during Lent, 2 farthings. One dance without sanction, 4. The scholars still argue whether this was piety or revenue dressed in righteousness, but the people living it knew better. Morality here was just another form of math. You wander past the alehouse from last night, now quiet but not innocent. The door bears a new notice. Fines will be levied for unlicensed songs of merriment. A man sweeping the doorstep mutters, "They'll start charging for smiles next." You grin, which, by the logic of the time, might already cost you. Inside, the smell of stale ale and wax lingers, a ghost of laughter taxed and tallied. On a shelf sits a small wooden box labeled Virtue Contributions, the church's polite euphemism for guilt money. Drop a coin, earn a little cosmic credit. Drop 2, and you might just get to keep your dignity after that second drink. You picture a monk counting the coins at night, humming hymns off key, the sound of penance clinking like small applause. Not all sin taxes were so mild. In some towns, moral inspectors roamed festivals, measuring sleeves, sniffing wine, and listening for laughter above an approved decibel. One account tells of a woman fined for dancing with excessive joy. Her defense: "My husband returned from war alive." The magistrate reportedly halved her penalty for poetic sorrow. You can almost see it, the gavel falling, the absurd mercy of a world afraid of too much happiness. Yet there's tenderness in that fear too. a belief that joy was too powerful to be left unregulated, that unchecked delight might unravel the fabric of humility. You watch the people in the square, their smiles small but genuine, the way they trade glances like contraband. They're paying the tax with irony now. Every grin a tiny act of rebellion. A group of merchants passes you, grumbling about the latest levy on imported luxuries, silk, sugar, perfume, the usual suspects in humanity's endless appetite. The so-called sumptuary sins, punished not for harm but for pleasure. A wealthy woman in a crimson gown walks by, her perfume scandalous, her expression proud. Children stare, and someone mutters that she'll be fined by evening. She smiles anyway, a small, perfect revolution. You catch the scent she leaves behind, spice, rosewater, defiance, and realize that beauty itself was once a taxable offense. Historians still debate whether these laws were designed to maintain morality or to keep the poor in their place. Probably both. Power always disguises envy as ethics. Further down the street, a priest stands by a wooden booth marked confession and contributions. The line is long. The smell of candle wax and incense hangs heavy, a reminder that forgiveness, too, has a price. You step closer and listen. A farmer confesses to eating meat on a Friday. The priest sighs, prescribes a fine, and blesses him with all the compassion of a tax collector. Behind him, a merchant admits to coveting profits too joyfully. His fine is doubled for enthusiasm. You shake your head, amused and a little awed. This is what faith looks like when it learns to monetize guilt. At the edge of the square, a jester is performing illegally, of course. His bells jingle softly, his grin wide, his jokes sharper than his shoes. He mocks the bishop, the taxes, the endless parade of rules. The crowd laughs in bursts, glancing nervously toward the constable, who watches with an expression that's equal parts fury and fascination. Even he can't resist a smile when the jester mimics the king's walk perfectly. For a fleeting moment, laughter wins. You feel it ripple through the crowd, a collective exhale, the sound of humanity remembering itself. Then the constable clears his throat, steps forward, and drops a coin into the jester's hat. "Tax," he says dryly. The crowd roars louder than ever. You can smell the relief in the air, like rain after drought. The sun climbs high, gilding the town in false virtue. A bell rings, signaling midday prayers, and people bow their heads as if the gesture might cancel their debts to joy. You stand quietly, watching a beggar boy chase his own shadow, his laughter pure and free. No one dares to stop him. In that moment, you see what all the fines and taxes missed, that happiness, like sin, always finds a loophole. You think of the scholars, centuries later, still debating whether these moral economies made society better or just more exhausted. The answer seems obvious from here. Evening falls. The square empties, but the echo of laughter lingers like incense. Somewhere, the jester hums a tune too soft to fine. The priests count their coins. The clerks close their ledgers, and the stars begin to pierce the dark. You walk toward the edge of town, where the last light spills across the road like forgiveness. The air smells of roasted chestnuts and freedom. You realize that every coin dropped in the name of virtue bought something more valuable than obedience. It bought proof that people would always find joy, even when it was outlawed. The night hums with quiet defiance, a song too human to silence, too priceless to tax. The forest looms ahead, dark and silent except for the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the distant caw of a raven, carrying the scent of moss, wet earth, and ancient authority. You step cautiously into the shadow of trees that the king himself claims. Because medieval forest law is no joke, even wandering near these woods without permission is trespass, punishable by fines, whippings, or worse. The air smells sweet with pine resin, but carries the subtle warning of unseen eyes. Deer glance up nervously, and you remember that hunting without royal license could cost a peasant his life. The charters of the forest, most famously established under Henry II, declared vast tracts reserved for the crown, protecting game for the elite, while condemning commoners to hunger if they dared feed themselves illegally. Historians still argue whether forest law was cruelty disguised as conservation or merely an early exercise in centralized control. But either way, the consequences were literal and immediate. You follow a narrow path, crunching through fallen leaves, the earthy perfume of decay and possibility mingling with the faint copper tang of blood from some unseen predator. Somewhere nearby, the rumor of haunted deer persists. Villagers swear that the spirits of hunted stags linger in the shadows, eyes glowing amber, bodies ethereal, warning mortals against trespassing. You feel a shiver of thrill. The forest is alive with superstition as much as law. Every rustle potentially divine or diabolical. A fox darts across your path, and you wonder if its cunning is instinct or an echo of outlawed souls. Folk tales tell of poachers disappearing into the trees, returning only as whispers or bones, their misdeeds memorialized in shadowed groves. You step carefully, aware that even the softest footprint can be considered evidence of rebellion. The smell of damp undergrowth grows stronger as you continue, mixing with the faint smoke of torches from a distant watchtower. Royal foresters patrol these woods, eyes sharp, staffs in hand, ready to enforce the law with an efficiency that borders on theatrical. You imagine peasants hiding behind oaks, clutching stolen rabbits or snares, hearts racing, breaths shallow, palms pressed to the bark like it might shield them from justice. The absurdity of the laws does not diminish their terror, it sharpens it. Fines and floggings are literal reminders that the forest is a place of controlled hunger, of privilege codified into every branch and every shadow. Yet the humor of human cunning persists. You picture a villager tying his goat to a tree and claiming it was a royal stag to bluff a forester, surely a story repeated over aleals with laughter under breath. A faint path opens into a clearing where moonlight dances on a still pond. The air smells wet and metallic, like danger mixed with frost. Somewhere in the distance an outlaw is said to whisper a lullaby to the hares, teaching them to dodge nets and arrows alike. The folklore of the forest is thick. Hunters speak of trees that move at night, of owls that guide trespassers to safety or doom. You feel it. Every legend is a warning, every shadow a story. Scholars debate whether these tales were meant to deter lawbreaking or simply to entertain. But in your mind, they do both. Every whispered ghost, every alleged shape in the mist, reminds you that the crown's control is never absolute, and the forest will always have its own memory. Deeper in, the scent of pine is joined by the sweet decay of mushrooms and fallen leaves. You step over a root, steadying yourself as a twig snaps underfoot. Somewhere, a stag pauses, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The king claims this animal belongs to him, but the stag belongs to the forest. You sense the tension between human law and natural law, the same tension that has always produced stories of stealthy peasants defying authority to survive. Some hid snares beneath bracken, others fished in forbidden streams, all risking punishment for a bite to eat. The humor of it, the clever dodge, the near miss with the forester permeates the air. You imagine a peasant laughing silently as he retrieves a rabbit he should not have caught, heart pounding with the thrill of survival and the absurdity of it all. A wind picks up, carrying with it the faint perfume of wildflowers and pine sap, mingled with the ghostly memory of the forest's history. Somewhere, a tree creaks like the sigh of a centuries-old conscience. You breathe in, tasting the mingling of authority, nature, and human cunning. The folklore is as alive as the law. Tales of spectral deer, vengeful spirits, and ghosts of poachers serve as both moral compass and entertainment. Even the scholars argue whether these stories reflect genuine belief or clever storytelling to enforce control. But, walking here, you feel the pulse of both, the thrill of being watched and the joy of bending the rules. You pause at a fallen log, damp with moss, and consider the elegance of survival under absurd restrictions. Every shadow could hide a forester. Every rustle might be a ghostly warning. Yet the forest is generous enough to let cleverness thrive. Villagers navigated these woods with wit, disguising nets as harmless branches, timing hunts with the forester's rounds, sometimes bribing a watchman with a scrap of meat or a coin. Humor persists in memory as much as in the present. A rabbit's head might have been a meal, a prop, or a weapon in a story retold with delight. The scholars still debate whether forest law was designed to protect game or to display cruelty. Either way, it created a stage for ingenuity and human audacity. As dusk falls, the shadows lengthen, and you can smell the chill of night mixing with pine and damp earth. Owls hoot, the wind whispers through the branches, and you hear the faint footfall of someone daring to cross the line between survival and punishment. Somewhere, laughter bubbles softly, a reminder that even in a place as controlled as the king's forest, the human spirit moves in secret. You exhale, tasting the sharp air, and realize that the laws of the forest do not just govern animals or trees, they govern courage, cunning, and the delicate art of being alive in a world that demands obedience. The night grows dense, every leaf and shadow a witness to small acts of rebellion, and you walk on, knowing that the thrill of survival is as eternal as the scent of pine and the echo of unseen hooves. The forest darkens further, but your path is lit by the glow of imagination and the faint shimmer of fireflies, which in folklore are said to be the spirits of hunted animals, hovering to warn or tease the living. You can smell damp earth, pine sap, and the faint tang of smoke from a distant cottage hearth, blending into the earthy perfume of moss and fallen leaves. Somewhere ahead, the muted sounds of a river wind through the undergrowth, and the rustle of nocturnal creatures keeps you alert. The law of the king is omnipresent here, invisible but heavy, marking the boundary between freedom and punishment. Poachers, clever and daring, moved through these woods with eyes wide, breath shallow, listening to the wind as if it whispered secrets only the brave could understand. Some hid snares under bracken, timing each step to avoid foresters, while others disguised stolen hares as gifts for neighbors, smirking as they crossed paths with authority. It is in these clever defiance and whispered conspiracies that humor emerges. Stories of near misses, clever disguises, and audacious trickery passed down like folklore. You come across a clearing where the moonlight spills silver over a cluster of ancient oaks. The air is thick with anticipation, and the faint metallic tang of justice, a reminder of the punishments that awaited anyone caught hunting unlawfully. The legends of the forest are everywhere. Spectral deer said to haunt the glades, warning hunters of their misdeeds, the whisper of outlawed souls rustling through leaves, and the ever-present moral line drawn by the king's authority, invisible but enforceable. Scholars still debate whether these stories were intended to truly instill fear or simply entertain and reinforce obedience through narrative. But you feel their purpose regardless. They keep the imagination alert and the heart racing. You tread carefully, feeling the crunch of fallen twigs underfoot, imagining the eyes of a forester or a hidden neighbor watching for the smallest misstep. A soft breeze carries the faint fragrance of wildflowers and pine resin, mingling with the earthy scent of soil and decaying leaves. Somewhere, a hare darts past, and you pause, marveling at its agility, aware that its freedom is contingent on your own careful steps. The forest, like the law, rewards cunning and punishes miscalculation. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, is a test of wits as much as endurance. You sense the tension in the air, a living embodiment of the delicate balance between human survival and royal decree. Humor threads through the tension. Tales of clever villagers fooling the foresters, hiding game in unlikely places, and outwitting authority circulate through whispers, as timeless and human as laughter itself. Further along, the path narrows, and the canopy thickens. The smell of damp moss is stronger here, and you notice the faint glitter of dew on leaves, like tiny natural jewels. The forest is both sanctuary and prison, alive with life and layered with centuries of law and legend. Folklore mixes with fact, ghosts of hunters past, whispers of unseen creatures, and spectral deer that guide or punish. Scholars still debate the origins of these tales, whether cautionary, symbolic, or spiritual, but their effect is palpable. Every step feels charged with history, superstition, and human ingenuity. You imagine peasants whispering to their children, teaching them how to tread carefully, how to respect the forest while bending the rules for survival. The forest is a teacher, a jailer, and a storyteller all at once. The night deepens, and the sounds of nocturnal life intensify. Owls hoot, a fox calls in the distance, and leaves rustle with the movement of unseen creatures. Somewhere, a lone wolf howls, a reminder that the forest is as wild and untamed as the laws imposed upon it. You breathe in the cold, sharp air, mingled with pine and the faint smell of smoke from distant fires. It is a world both threatening and exhilarating, where cunning, courage, and stealth are rewarded. Villagers have survived here for centuries, guided by a mix of fear, superstition, and audacity, always aware of the line between obedience and survival. Finally, you reach the edge of the forest, where moonlight spills onto open fields. The scent of wet grass and pine lingers in the air, carrying the memory of stealthy hunts and whispered escapes. You pause, realizing that the forest law was more than regulation, it was an arena for human ingenuity, resilience, and humor. The haunted deer, the outlaw tales, the watchful foresters, they all exist to test cleverness and courage. And even as the shadow of authority stretches over the land, the audacity of the people persists. Clever poachers, daring villagers, and silent laughter moving like ghosts through the trees. You step into the moonlit field, carrying with you the scent of pine, the thrill of defiance, and the knowledge that even under the strictest laws, the human spirit finds its way. The morning light spills softly over the town, gentle and forgiving, carrying with it the faint scent of dew, smoke, and the lingering memory of every absurdity you've witnessed along this journey. The streets are quiet now, the echoes of curfews, fines, and trials softened by distance and time, and the air feels lighter, almost sacred in its simplicity. You walk slowly, tracing the worn cobblestones that have held generations of footsteps, peasants fleeing curfew bells, bakers sweating over honest loaves, lovers whispering in defiance of moral fines, foresters stalking forbidden game, and jesters jingling the truth behind laughter. The sunlight hits the roofs at an angle that makes the timber glow golden, and somewhere, a bird trills a note that feels almost like a benediction. History itself seems to exhale, its weight distributed across every patch of shadow and sun. The reforms of law have softened the edges. Curfews no longer punish, beards no longer carry taxes, and moral fines have become artifacts of memory rather than instruments of control. You feel a strange peace in the knowledge that what once was rigid, cruel, and absurd has bent toward humanity over centuries. Passing through the marketplace, you see traces of what once enforced control. The worn posts where stocks once stood, the faded notice boards listing fines for laughter, the cobblestones dulled by centuries of trampling judgment and defiance alike. The smell of fresh bread rises from a nearby bakery, its aroma innocent now, carrying only sustenance and comfort. You remember the smell of burned flesh in trials, the copper tang of blood in ordeals, and the heavy tang of smoke from covered fires, and you realize how far the balance between law and life has shifted. Where once human creativity and joy were met with strict punishment, now they are met with quiet tolerance or forgotten altogether. There's a certain poetry in that transformation. Humanity, resilient, has bent the rules of law to accommodate the breath and laughter of life itself. The scholars still debate the efficacy of medieval justice, the morality of punishments, and the intent of those in power. But you know in your bones that the essence of civilization lies not in enforcement, but in the slow, careful expansion of mercy over time. You wander past the churchyard where countless moral fines and holy punishments were recorded in parchment, the ink long faded but the memory heavy in the air. Sunlight filters through the stained glass, and for a moment, you can see the faces of those who suffered under the laws, the baker whose loaf was too light, the youth whose kiss was taxed, the forester who stole a rabbit to feed his starving family, and even the accused animals who stood in judgment as if capable of understanding. The absurdity of it all lingers like a ghost, a reminder of how far humanity has come, and how enduring the spirit of creativity and defiance truly is. You breathe in the faint smell of grass and incense, and it feels like absolution, a quiet nod from history that laughter, ingenuity, and courage have always outlasted oppression. Continuing through the town, you notice small details. A repaired post where once a sign warned of fines, a rebuilt bridge that once carried prisoners to public shaming, and the gentle ripple of water in the fountain that once overflowed with spilled judgment. The air carries the scent of baking, herbs, and clean stone. You can almost hear whispers of the past, a child giggling while hiding stolen fruit, a jester improvising a song to mock the unjust, a clerk chuckling quietly as he records a minor transgression. These traces are subtle, yet they speak volumes about the endurance of humanity under absurd laws. Every misstep, every clever dodge, every act of defiance has left an imprint woven into the very fabric of the town. You feel the weight of centuries on your shoulders, but it is tempered with relief, understanding, and even joy. As you reach the town's edge, the sunlight softens into a golden hue, illuminating fields and distant woods that once enforced royal decrees. The wind carries the scent of wildflowers, pine, and the faint smoke of distant hearths. You reflect on the absurdity and cruelty that once dominated life, the fines for laughter, the taxes on beards, the trials of animals, the curfews and covered fires, the strictures on affection, the policing of markets and forests. Yet you also recognize the human capacity to endure, adapt, and even subvert. The same people who suffered these punishments laughed, loved, and found small ways to bend the rules, creating a living, breathing counterpoint to the law. The moral of it is clear. Laws change, society evolves, but the human spirit, mischievous and resilient, persists. You pause atop a gentle hill overlooking the town, the panorama bathed in late afternoon light. The rooftops glow warmly. The streets are empty but humming faintly with the memory of countless lives, and the air is fragrant with the mingled scents of history: bread, pine, incense, and rain-washed stone. You can almost feel the heartbeat of the town itself, echoing with every story of absurdity, defiance, and survival. Where once punishment reigned, today memory reigns. Where fear once dictated action, reflection now fills the spaces between the stones. The past is present here, not as terror but as testament, a reminder that humanity has always survived by weaving humor, cunning, and empathy through even the harshest structures of control. You inhale deeply, letting the light, the air, and the memory settle into your senses. The sun dips toward the horizon, painting the town in shades of amber and rose. The bells toll quietly now, not for curfew, not for condemnation, but simply to mark the passage of time. You think of all the laws, fines, and punishments you've walked past in imagination: the curfew bells, the assize of bread and ale, sumptuary regulations, trials of beasts, moral fines, forest charters, ordeals by fire and water, the policing of beards and sound, and the innumerable absurdities of civic and religious control. They were real, they were absurd, and they were human. And yet, here at last, they rest in memory rather than action. The town exhales. The streets are quiet. The wind carries the faintest laugh, a whisper of resilience that has persisted across centuries. You step forward, feeling the soft earth beneath your feet, the cool air on your skin, and the gentle understanding that civilization, in its messy human way, has survived not by cruelty alone, but by bending, forgiving, and laughing. You pause at the edge of the town square, the scents, sounds, and shadows of the past fading like mist. The memories of fines, taxes, and trials mingle with the enduring truth that humanity is endlessly inventive, endlessly mischievous, and endlessly capable of survival. The absurdities you've witnessed: curfews, bread laws, sumptuary decrees, animal trials, moral fines, forest restrictions, ordeals, grooming regulations, and joy taxation, are now tempered by centuries of change, reflection, and adaptation. And in this soft, glowing twilight, you feel the weight of history lighten, the lessons settle, and the stories breathe. You inhale one last time, carrying with you the scents of pine, bread, candle wax, and rain, feeling the pulse of lives lived fully under absurd human rules, and the enduring echo of laughter and courage that has survived them all. End of script. Sweet dreams.